Thank you very much again for being here. Also welcome to the participants in the session here, and also welcome to those who are watching us on YouTube. So we look forward to an exciting discussion. The purpose of this event is to engage in a discussion about the need for managing the risks of temperature overshoot and issues relating to the governance of large-scale carbon dioxide removal and solar radiation modification. We have various speakers who will come to that in a moment. I think it's just worth to say a few words. First of all, that Mr. Nitin Desai was going to give an overview introduction, and he was called in for some personal reason. He might make it later on this session. So we agreed with him that if he cannot make it at the beginning, he will instead close the session. So I will now say a few words on his behalf and do that. But before I say a few words, just to mention that we indeed have some excellent speakers with us. We have Thelma Krug, Vice Chair of the IPCC, who will make a keynote speech. And then we also had the principal science advisor to the government of India, Dr. Sood, with us. He unfortunately couldn't make it either in person nor virtually at this time. So he sent a pre-recorded video. So what we'll do is we'll have Thelma do her keynote, and then we'll show Dr. Sood's presentation, and then we go into the panel, and we will go through the panel discussion at that time. So let me just say a few words of why we're having this session. And one question that one can ask, why even bother talking about these issues? We know we have a climate crisis. We don't need to go into that. We know we have to reduce our emissions. We don't need to go into that. But why are we talking about these additional techniques like carbon dioxide removal and solar radiation modification and their governance needs? So on the one hand, countries have set themselves net zero targets by mid-century. Many of them by 2050, some 2060, some by 2070. But when you say net zero, it automatically means that you have to make use of some kind of carbon dioxide removal. So the issue, what was said before by the IPCC, that we need so much carbon dioxide removal at the global level, that is now becoming a reality at the country level as well. So that issue is there, and one needs to figure out how to do it. Now, we have progress with emission reductions. I think that is clear. We have to recognize that, but the trends are simply not good enough. And even the IPCC makes it very clear that there is now an increasing likelihood that we will overshoot the 1.5, higher probability than not overshooting it. And these will have catastrophic impacts. We can see what's happening in the world today at an average of 1.1, 1.2 degrees. So the fact is that the world is going to get warmer, and there will be impacts, and we have to manage those impacts. And that's the second reason why we need to talk about these issues. And there's one more, and the IPCC also recognizes this, that the fact that there is no comprehensive framework in particular for the solar radiation modification part, that is a risk by itself. And therefore, and there are certain things happening in the world, and therefore it is important to start talking about these governance issues. So that's just a few words to introduce the topic. We'll hear a lot more from our speakers. I don't want to dominate the discussion on that. Now, as I said, we have some amazing speakers. Later, when we get to the panel discussion, I will ask the speakers to introduce themselves. I think that works out better. But we do have the two initial speakers, and I would like to ask first Thelma Krug to give us her keynote presentation. Thelma is a former researcher at the Earth Observation Coordination at the National Institute for Space Research in Brazil under the Ministry of Science, Technology, Innovation and Communication. She was elected Vice Chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change for the 6th cycle. after having been co-chair of the IPCC Task Force on National Greenhouse Gas Inventories from 2002 to 2015. She undertook various senior positions at the Ministry of Environment and represented Brazil in the negotiations at the UN Framework Convention for more than 15 years. Thelma, welcome, and we look forward to your words.
Yeah, thank you very much, Janos, and good morning to all participants. Here from Bellagio Center, where I am at a meeting on SRM evaluation in the Global South. So unfortunately, I could not be there in person. So I'm thanking the organizers for the invitation for me to set the scene for the presentations that will follow. So basically, my presentation will focus on information and findings from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that have been carried out in the last 7 years in topics of interest to this meeting, including overshoot and climate responses to it, such as carbon dioxide removal and solar radiation modification. So this, the next slide is slide 2. She's helping me here with the slides. So I always like to provide definitions so everybody's on the same understanding. So IPCC defines overshoot as emission pathways that first exceed a specified concentration or normally global warming level, say 1.5, and then return to or below that level again before the end of a specified period of time, for example, before 2100. And I provided the IPCC definition because there are other understandings of overshoot when you have the exceedance, but you don't include bringing it back to that level or below it. The next slide. So in this next slide, it comes from the IPCC special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius of 2018. The assessment was made on pathways that limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So this slide shows the evolution of anthropogenic net emissions of CO2 in model pathways that limit global warming to that level with no or limited overshoot. When we say limited overshoot, it's because the temperature exceedance is not going to be beyond 0.1 degrees Celsius above 1.5. But the blue envelope that you see in this slide, it includes the emission pathways with no or limited overshoot, but you see that there are other pathways, and these are the ones with higher overshoot that are outside the envelope, the blue envelope. But there is a common feature of these pathways in that CO2 emissions are reduced to net zero globally around 2050, which will require ambitious mitigation strategies at global and national levels. So different mitigation strategies can achieve the net emission reductions that would be required to follow a pathway that limits global warming to 1.5 with no or limited overshoot. But all pathways use carbon dioxide removal, they're non-CDR, but the amount of CDR varies across pathways, as do the relative contributions of different CDR approaches, which I will introduce later on. The next slide. Well, this slide is from the IPCC Working Group 1, which works on the physical basis of climate change, and which assessed the climate response to 5 illustrative scenarios that cover the range of possible future development of anthropogenic drivers of climate change that was found in the literature. From bottom to up, we have scenarios from very low, low, intermediate, high, and very high greenhouse gas emissions. So CO2 emissions vary between these scenarios depending on socioeconomic assumptions, levels of climate change mitigation, and others. But for each one of these scenarios, as you see on the right-hand side, the global surface temperature average over the period of 2081-2100 is very likely to be higher by 1 to 1.8 degrees Celsius in the very low greenhouse gas emission scenario, and by 3.3 to 5.7 degrees Celsius in the very high scenario, the two endpoints in the figure. So we can see from that figure that for the very low and low emission scenarios, CO2 emissions reach net zero by around 2050 and around 2070, followed by net negative emissions, a situation which is achieved when anthropogenic greenhouse gas removals exceed anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions, which can be achieved through carbon dioxide removal methods. The next slide. So first I would like to introduce the definition of carbon dioxide removal from the IPCC glossary, which is anthropogenic activities that remove CO2 from the atmosphere and store it durably in geological, terrestrial, or ocean reservoirs, or in products. It includes anthropogenic enhancement of biological, geochemical, or chemical CO2 sinks, but excludes natural CO2 uptake not directly caused by human activities. So, CDR cannot serve as a substitute for deep emission reductions, but can fulfill multiple complementary roles. For instance, it can further reduce net CO2 or greenhouse gas emission levels in the near term. It can counterbalance residual emissions from hard to transition sectors, such as CO2 from industrial activities, and long-term transport, such as aviation, shipping, and can also achieve and sustain net negative CO2 in the long term by deploying CDR at levels exceeding annual residual gross CO2. The next slide. Well, there are many different CDR methods, some of which I highlighted in yellow in this slide, that have been practiced for decades to millennia. You see there afforestation, reforestation, forest management. So these have been practiced to millennia and decades, although not necessarily with the intention of removing carbon from the atmosphere. Conversely, the methods that I highlight in green, these are novel. You can see there bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. You can see ducts as well, which we are going to see later on. While the experience is growing on these methods, their demonstration and deployment are limited in scale. The next slide. So the table in this slide shows that under TRL, that you see the column there, which refers to technological maturity level. And this technological maturity level for the CDR options or that I have mentioned before in the previous slide, this maturity level range from 1, when the basic principles have been defined, to 9, when the methodology has been proven in operational environment. So you see from the slide that although the more mature CDR methods are on the table on the right, you can see the TRLs being 8, 9 for afforestation, reforestation, for also the forest management. So you see the highest scores for the technical maturity there, but there is a concern with the time scale of storage. So carbon stored in ocean reservoirs and in geological formations through bioenergy with carbon storage or DACs generally has longer storage times and is less vulnerable to reversal through human actions or disturbances such as drought and wildfire than carbon stored in terrestrial reservoirs like vegetation or soil forests. Other information shown in the table include the cost of each of these options, their mitigation potential, and also the risks and impacts. So I cannot go in detail because of my time limit here. So the next slide, So if emission reductions in Syria are deemed insufficient, SRM or solar radiation modification may be seen by some as the only option left to ensure the achievement of the Paris Agreement temperature goal by 2100. So SRM refers to proposals to increase the reflection of sunlight back to space to counteract anthropogenic warming and some of its harmful impacts. And a number of SRM options have been proposed, including stratospheric aerosol intervention, the most studied one, marine cloud brightening, ground-based albedo modifications, and ocean albedo change. Next slide. And there is high agreement in the literature that for addressing climate change risks, SRM cannot be the main policy response to climate change. And it is at best a supplement to achieving sustained net zero or net negative CO2 emission levels globally. So SRM contrasts with climate change mitigation activities such as emission reductions and carbon dioxide removal, as it introduces a mask to the climate change problem by altering the Earth's radiation budget rather than attempting to address the root cause of the problem, which is the increase in greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. The next slide. This next slide shows for each method that I cannot get into detail due to the time limit, the potential climate impacts other than reduced warming or potential impacts on human and natural systems, and also determination effect when you, for instance, deploy SRM. In some cases, some of the methods are not affected by that, but some are, like for instance, the SAI, the stratospheric injection. So solar modification approaches have the potential to offset warming and ameliorate other climate hazards, but their potential to reduce risk or introduce novel risks to people and ecosystems is not yet very well understood. Due in part to limited research, there is low confidence in projected benefits or risks to crop yields, economies, human health, or ecosystems. And large negative impacts are projected from rapid warming for a sudden and sustained termination of SRM in high CO2 scenario. The next and last slide. So currently there is no dedicated formal international SRM governance for research, development, demonstration, or deployment. Some multilateral agreements, such as the Convention on Biological Diversity or the Vienna Convention on the Protection of the Ozone Layer, indirectly and partially cover SRM, but none is comprehensive. And the lack of robust and formal SRM governance poses risks. So while governance objectives range broadly from prohibition to enabling research and potentially deployment, there is agreement that SRM governance should cover all interacting stages of research through to any potential eventual deployment with rules, institutions, and norms. And finally, co-evolution of SRM governance and research provides a chance for responsibly developing SRM technologies with broader public participation and political legitimacy guarding against potential risks and harms relevant across a full range of scenarios. So with that, I hope that I have set the scene, gave some a very broad. When Janos tasked me to do that presentation, and he was like, you go overshoot, you go CDR, you go SRM, you go governance, and I said, I have 10 minutes. So Janos, I hope that I have provided some insights. Obviously, the details are going to be provided in some presentations to come. And I thank you very much for the invitation. And sorry again for not being there, and sorry for not being able to continue and respond to the questions because I have to engage with the other discussions going here in the larger center. Thank you very much, Janos.
And thank you very much, Thelma. And we understand you're in a big meeting on the other side of the globe. So thank you for that. And now we would like to turn to Professor Sood, who is the Principal Scientific Advisor to the Government of India. He's also chairperson of the Prime Minister's Science, Technology and Innovation Advisory Council and a National Science Chair at the Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore. He was also a member of the Prime Minister's Science, Technology and Innovation Advisory Council, and also a member of the Scientific Advisory Council to the Prime Minister of India. So we will hear a pre-recorded video message from him now. Thank you.
I'm happy to participate as a panelist in the thematic track, the science and governance of climate altering techniques, implications for sustainable development. I apologize that I am not able to participate in person and hence this recorded message. Carbon dioxide removal and solar radiation modification technologies represent a critical part of the effort to address the global climate crisis, and there is a growing consensus among the scientific community that they should be considered to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement and limit the worst impacts of climate change. CDR, or carbon dioxide removal, focuses on absorbing carbon from the atmosphere and increasing carbon sinks at a scale. These include direct air capture of CO2 using the industrial scale plants, carbon capture via biomass, and other conventional approaches such as afforestation and sustainable land use management. Novel approach include ocean fertilization, which involves adding nutrients to the ocean to promote the growth of phytoplankton which absorb CO2. In India, multiple industries and academic institutions are working on carbon dioxide removal initiatives. For example, BHEL has established a 6.5 megawatt integrated gasification combined cycle power plant to study and implement the prospects of pre-combustion capture technologies. Another example, Indian Oil Corporation Limited, in partnership with Praj Industries, is working on a pilot project that uses carbon dioxide to produce biofuels. On the academic front, the National Centers of Excellence in Carbon Capture and Utilization are being set up at IIT Bombay and JNCASR Bangalore with support from the Department of Science and Technology, Government of India. Apart from these, selected IITs, ICERs and other institutions are working on CDR techniques such as enhanced coal bed methane recovery in the coal blocks, designing and developing a highly energy efficient system for CO2 capture from power plants, synthesizing novel solid adsorbents, CO2 capture and utilization. However, we must know that there are certain controversies around CDR which involve dangers of monocultures and habit destruction. Now I will come to solar radiation modification, SRM. This is a form of geoengineering that aims to reduce the amount of sunlight reaching the Earth's surface by reflecting more of it into space. Example of SRM related technologies include terrestrial operations, stratospheric aerosol injection, marine cloud brightening, and cirrus cloud thinning. The research pertaining to SRM technologies are at a very nascent stage in India. On the issue of governance, the Council on Energy, Environment and Water, based in New Delhi, has organized 3 international conferences since 2011. These have attempted to identify the role of India in developing regional and global governance mechanisms on solar geoengineering. The Department of Science and Technology, India, has been supporting an active climate modeling research program in geoengineering at the Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore. The notable global initiatives include the Harvard SRM Governance Initiative, studying the governance and ethical issues surrounding SRM, European Academy of Sciences, investigating the effectiveness, risks and governance implications of SRM, and provide policy recommendations to decision makers, and Solar Radiation Management Governance Initiative, ensuring geoengineering research is conducted in a responsible, transparent and environmentally sound manner. SRM technologies have generated multiple controversies, implications around it. For example, stratospheric aerosol injection has potential social and ethical issues around public consent and has the potential to spawn international conflicts. The vital governance issue is the possibility that this technology may end up concentrating power in rich countries or non-state actors in the global north. These technologies may also disrupt existing global governance structures such as the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. It may also create a need for new governance structures such as decentralized or distributed governance models, where deployment authority by countries is constrained according to their historical emissions. Now, these techniques are viewed as a temporary gap measure and can distract funding away from accelerated climate mitigation and energy transition. Most SRM methods operate only one of the climate change outcomes, that is temperature, without addressing its root cause, that is anthropogenic greenhouse gas emission. Without explicitly reducing and CO2 removal, SRM would not be as effective. In the context of the global south, the CDR and SRM techniques may appear appealing given the context of dire climate consequences faced by them, including typhoons, cyclones, prolonged droughts, and El Nino currents, which contribute to reduced crop yields, transboundary forest fires, flooding, and others. These climate-related hazards are further compounded by heterogeneous social, political, and economic situations. However, the adoption of these technologies will be slower due to the general lack of observational and climate data, funding, and capacity to conduct relevant research, which includes research staffing and time. The Global South is underrepresented in governance structures for CDR and SRM, which could limit their ability to shape the deployment and development of these techniques. The governance should be guided by principles of international cooperation and coordination, including thorough existing international governance structure such as the United Nations Framework Convention for climate change. It should be open and transparent, with opportunities for meaningful participation by a range of stakeholders, including governments, civil society, and affected communities. An integrated assessment of climate change mitigation and adaptation options must be considered rather than working in isolation. Assessment should include environmental and social impact, along with the risks involved and the unintended consequences. Robust monitoring and continuous evaluation mechanisms must be developed to assess the effectiveness and impacts of the technique. Building the capacity of countries in the Global South to participate in the benefits from the governance of carbon dioxide removal and solar radiation modification is crucial to ensure that decision making is inclusive and equitable. More funding can be made available to Global South, modelers, social scientists, and policy analysts so that the inclusive geoengineering can take off. I'll just close this remark by saying that South-South and the South-North collaborations and research initiatives are imperative. These results can then be compared and analyzed to ensure that the funding, capacity development efforts, and collaborations are more targeted. Thank you for your attention.
I would like to thank Dr. Sood for his remarks, and particularly for bringing up not just some of the technical issues, but also about some of the governance issues that may need to take place. So now we can turn to the panel discussion. And just one word here, I've seen that we filled up all the chairs in the room, and that's great. And thanks to the conference organizers, they brought some more chairs. So let's get those other people inside who were waiting outside so that they can also enjoy the discussion. So we have with us a number of 4 panelists, three of them connecting from different parts of the world, and one of them here with me. And what I would like to do is I'd like to ask first each of them to introduce themselves. I think it's much better that way. So if each of you could, in 1 minute, tell the audience who you are and why you're interested in this topic. Let's start with Joe Tyndall, please.
Yes, hello, Janos and everybody else. It's great to be part of this panel today. I'm Joe Tyndall, the Director of the Environment Directorate at the OECD, so covering not only climate change, but also a whole raft of other environmental issues, including biodiversity, plastics, pollution, chemical hazards, etc., etc. Prior to taking up this job, I spent the best part of a decade as New Zealand's climate change ambassador in the lead up to and after the development, adoption, and entry into effect of the Paris Agreement.
Thank you very much. Maybe we can move to Gabriella Ramos.
Good morning. I hope that you can hear me now.
Yes.
This is Gabriela Ramos, Assistant Director General for Social and Human Sciences here at UNESCO. And this sector is looking into maximizing the contribution that social and human sciences can make to understand these very complex issues. And actually in my sector, I have the Committee of Ethics of Technology and the International Bioethics Committee, and we are looking into the climate change issues from the governance perspective, from the ethical perspective. I will share a little bit more with you, what are we doing there. But we just got, for example, the ethics of artificial intelligence recommendation that is really developing a lot of measures institutionally, regulatory, to ensure that these technologies are deployed ethically. But I'm also managing the Managing of Social Transformation program that is looking at how these very major trends, climate, digital, demography, inequality, is having an impact in our societies. Before, Joe, we didn't know, but I was the Chief of Staff and Sherpa of the OECD, and we did a lot of very good work there. Great to be with you, Janos.
Thank you very much. And now we go literally to the other side of the globe, to Fiji. We have Ambassador Yavoli Amina. Can you please say a few words about yourself?
Yes, good evening, and I hope you guys are hearing me well. Good evening from Suva, Fiji. Hi, Joe. Good to see you. Joe and I used to work very closely together in the leading up to Paris, the Paris Agreement, with some climate leadership roles that we played together. For Fiji, a small island developing state, always representing the interests of Pacific states as well as other small island developing states in our climate forum or negotiations. I'm really interested in this discussion this afternoon, despite its lateness here in Fiji. It's after 9 p.m. in the night. I think it is crucial that we as small island developing states are represented in this forum. And I thank you, Janos, for inviting me.
Thank you very much. And the last panelist, Manish, who is also co-organizer, TERI, of this event, please.
Welcome everybody, and my name is Manish Srivastava. I'm a senior fellow here at TERI with the Earth Science and Climate Change Division. My research area is the politics and policy for climate change. By training, I'm a science policy analyst, so this theme is of great academic interest to me beyond its politics and practical issues.
Thank you very much. And now I would like to ask our first panelist a question. But before I do, I just want to encourage the colleagues who are here in the audience to think about some good questions, take note, and there will be time and opportunity for a question and answer session with our panelists. So think about that. So let's start with Joe Tyndall. And if maybe I could ask you to start our panel discussion by describing how you see the evolution of science related to these techniques and how the governance of these approaches is likely to evolve in your assessment. Over to you. And please keep your initial remarks to less than 5 minutes, and then we'll have some interaction. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Janos. I think I want to begin by saying that today's discussion is really timely and very important. But at the same time, that's a bit of an indictment of decades of failed efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But as we've already heard, there's a long way to go before climate-altering techniques have the potential to become a viable policy option. Because both scientific and governance questions need to be answered first. Now, we obviously don't have a great deal of time left, not just because we didn't use the time we had to prepare wisely, but also because, as we've heard from just our previous speaker, CDR is already happening, the cat's out of the bag, as it were. And I just wanted to refer quickly to a report the OECD Environment Directorate recently published, Climate Tipping Points, because it picks up on some of the things Thelma Krug was talking about, highlighting that the planet is already approaching some tipping points today, and it's doing so considerably in advance of the timelines projected in earlier modeling. Now, why is that relevant? It's relevant because it's not just a question of getting to net zero, but also the pathway to it that counts. And I think that Thelma kind of alluded to this. So first of all, we need, ideally, of course, to avoid crossing tipping points. But also, if they are crossed, we need to look urgently for options to keep the temperature overshoot as low and as short-lived as possible. And it's in this context, obviously, that techniques like CCUS or SRM might be relevant, but we know that carbon capture and storage is taking a very long time to become commercially viable. And there are some concerns that this will slow down the phase out of fossil fuels, while SRM covers a considerable array of measures, some of which raise legitimate questions and concerns about unintended consequences already been talked about, not only for climate change, but also for example, biodiversity. So the point is that if these tipping points are crossed, they could have disastrous impacts, including extreme temperatures, higher frequency of droughts, forest fires, unprecedented weather patterns, kind of really making even worse the impacts of climate change we're already seeing. The infrastructure to govern climate altering techniques at both the national and international levels, as we well know, is just not yet in place. It's a crucial needs solved, and it's particularly relevant. It hasn't quite come up yet. Some of these techniques have cross-border impacts and risk unintended consequences. So unregulated experimentation has the potential to be catastrophic, including potentially impacting regions that are not participating in the experimentation. I was trying to think of an analogy, and the best thing that came to mind immediately was nuclear testing, for example. So the geopolitical implications of some of this could be dramatic. I think there's already been a mention of these techniques needing to be supplementary. Thelma mentioned that too. But in putting governance structures in place, a key point, I think, from the OECD's point of view is to avoid path dependency. In other words, an internal momentum towards deploying climate altering techniques. That's key. Since we've got limited resources to tackle climate change, the investments in technologies that can deliver 1.5 degrees centigrade through Celsius through mitigation, that needs to be prioritized over more uncertain, potentially riskier geoengineering techniques. We've really got to avoid the risk of moral from over-prioritizing climate altering technologies at the cost of reducing ambition on greenhouse gas emissions. So the path dependency risks being triggered both by research and technology development, as well as governance structures. And I think we've already heard a very important point. First, any governance approach needs to be designed and applied universally, but also in sync with the research that definitely needs to be done. So I agree, transparency, justice, and broad engagement in the design and implementation of the structures are necessary to govern, they're needed to govern climate altering techniques. And just very, very quickly, to outline the sort of role the OECD can play in supporting policymakers to develop best practices. So in this respect, it's what we've been doing for the past 50 years on a range of social, economic, and environmental challenges. And what we're focusing on in particular is facilitating urgent, ambitious, and effective action to reduce emissions, and including through the recently launched Inclusive Forum on Carbon Mitigation Approaches, and providing analysis to ensure the resilience of the transition to net zero. So it's not knocked off course by the kinds of crises we've seen since COVID and with cost of living increases, energy crises, and the war in Ukraine, and as well as ensuring the resilience to climate change impacts. So that's the kind of focus we want to put in terms of policy analysis and development of guidance and advice.
Thank you very much, Jo, and thank you for highlighting this important or recalling again the importance of the pathway. It's not just where we need to get to, but how we get there. Can I ask you two very quick follow-up questions? Very briefly, if you could address them. One is, it's about the tipping points. Why is it so important to address them, and what are there any specific governance approaches that you think that are relevant for the tipping point? And then the second one is just any further thoughts you may have on how to avoid a slippery slope, because you mentioned that, and I agree with you, it's important, but what can we put in place concretely? So if you could try to address these very difficult questions.
Well, thanks, Janos. Difficult questions. So the tipping points question for a start. The point being, of course, we're already seeing extreme weather, and the need for adaptation is already obvious and growing fast. The point about tipping points is twofold. One, if they are crossed, if the threshold is crossed, they are irreversible. They might take a long time to unfold over, years or decades or whatever. There are things like damage to the ice sheets in the Antarctic, but also Arctic. And the second point is that they are connected. Ocean currents, et cetera, so it's not just a case of crossing one tipping point. If you kind of start down that track, you're risking a cascading effect with multiple tipping points that could just, magnify and blow climate change impacts out of the water. That's probably not a very good analogy, but you kind of know what I mean. So I would encourage people to look at the OECD report. It does present some thoughts or options, what we can do to avoid or mitigate the risk of crossing those tipping points. But I come back to the fact that we know we've got to take urgent action on climate change. But we're not doing it fast enough. Governments are, sort of designing and implementing policies, but getting this underway is taking too long. So the Inclusive Forum, the IFCMA I referred to, is one approach we're hoping from a kind of, it's not purely governance. It is about providing a forum and some analysis to work out not only taking a stock take of the full range of mitigation approaches, both market-based and non-market-based, price and non-price-based, but also making an assessment of the effectiveness of policies, given that they will be being applied in different circumstances, and their effectiveness in terms of reducing emissions. The point I should note is that it is super important in thinking, certainly at a government level, about taking a systems approach to how. So it's a question of mainstreaming climate policy, but also taking a systems approach, so that you can kind of look at the bits of the iceberg that are below the surface of the water, and think about whole of economy consequences, whether those are intended or unintended, and try to plan policies and design and implement them in the best possible way. And the last thing is we are also doing planning further work on positive tipping points. So what can we do to counteract crossing those negative tipping points? What can we do to really accelerate the mitigation approaches that will avoid us crossing tipping points in the first place?
Thank you, and it's good to finish on that positive note there. So with that, I'd like to now turn to Gabriella Ramos. And Gabriella, we just heard Dr. Sood's presentation. I think he mentioned ethics 3 times in his presentation, and I know that UNESCO is doing something about that. So maybe you could help us to tell us what UNESCO is doing and how that fits into this discussion. So over to you.
Thank you so much, Janos. And yes, I have been carefully listening to all my previous presentations, and it's just amazing how much the ethical reflection has something to do with this, because this is not a technological debate. This is a governance debate. This is a societal debate. This is a political debate. And you have heard how many angles the deployment or not of these technologies have raised just in the work that you're doing, but also in the presentations that preceded me. At UNESCO, as I mentioned, we have the Committee of the Ethics of Technology and Committee of Biotechnology. And these committees, what they do, of course, is to try to understand better how these technologies work. We have done issues on artificial intelligence, on Internet of Things, on questions related to climate change, the ethics of climate change. But the whole point is to say sometimes technologies are ahead of the human framework that needs to cover them, because probably they are being done in laboratories in the global north, probably because they are really promising. These emerging technologies always have this dual effect of being super promising, but at the same time causing a lot of uncertainties. And therefore, we need the ethical guidelines to help us organize the thinking and put people at the center. Because as I said, this is not a technological debate. We have heard it before. Who is going to take the decision of using these technologies? Who is going to ensure that there is no unintended consequences or harm? Who is going to invest or not? Where is it going to happen? How is it going to happen? All these questions, I think, need to be answered. And that's why in UNESCO, we are always saying ethics ex ante. We just developed the standard, the global standard with 193 countries on the ethics of artificial intelligence. You see ChatGPT in the market, and there was no ethics ex ante, because now we're seeing where are the probable downsides of these technologies, and this is exactly what cannot happen with this technology. We need to answer some of the questions related to the governance before we decide how to do it. And in this governance, we need to ensure that it is inclusive, that is not just taken by those that are capable to develop the technologies. We need to have all the voices in the table, even if the global south is not really on top of the issues technically or in terms of capabilities, but they need to be part of this debate and they need to be taken seriously. It has to be multidisciplinary. It cannot be only those that really know how these things work from the physical, biological. It needs to be multidisciplinary. And this is something that UNESCO has always pursued. If you are going to discuss these issues, you need the philosophers, you need the historians, you need all these people that can bring a very different perspective. And you need to do it in a multi-stakeholder approach, because at the end, we need to hear what the societies, what the youth, what the people want to do about it. This is the way we organize these discussions at UNESCO. We actually, in 2017, we had the ethics of climate change. And I think it's very appropriate, the kind of principles that we put there to inform the discussions that we are having now, because the principles that were advanced in terms of organizing this thinking were prevention of harm. And then the question is, are we really sure that there will be no harm? Second, the precautionary approach. Third, justice and equity. 4, sustainable development, of course. 5, solidarity. And 6, scientific knowledge and integrity of decision making. And I want to make a very strong point here, because these things don't happen in a political vacuum. Even in COP27, what we are seeing is that we cannot not even mention fossil fuels. If we all know that we are not on the path to 1.5. We are still thinking, how are we going to deliver on 2.5? When you established the overshoot committee, it was just a reflection of some possibilities that we can, that we would need to put at the table if and when we do not meet the deadlines. And at the end, what we're seeing is that we're not back on track. And we're not back on track because of political consideration or vested interests or political economy of the discussions. And therefore, we cannot just put another debate on how these technologies are going to be delivering for good if we do not deliver on the other areas. And I feel this political debate is really appropriate because of the moral hazard that some speakers have mentioned, and the question of relaxing because we have this at hand. The other point is, how do we ensure that we are all in the same page? I'm not sure that even the most advanced thinkers know what we're talking about. But we know that the planes now are being built in the US for these very impressive experiments to happen. And therefore, we really need to socialize this knowledge. It concerns the whole of humanity. And we need to make sure that this is really happening in a context in which we are considering all the uncertainties. We cannot solve all the issues. I'm working now on the question of the ethics of artificial intelligence. You cannot address all the issues. You cannot codify all the issues. You cannot solve all the questions before you deploy these technologies. It's not feasible. But at the end, you can at least put the most important outcomes that you may imagine and try to shape them in a way that are, as I said, inclusive and that they deliver for good. So this is the ethical approach, and I think it's a very important framing of the discussions. What are we doing at UNESCO? I have 34 experts developing a report on the ethics of climate engineering. This report is going to be delivered this year. Is going to contribute to the discussions on these issues, and particularly in COP28. I'm working with several foundations to look at how we can develop more knowledge and make it more known. We need to do a lot of awareness raising. We need to share the knowledge. We need to be transparent of these discussions and invite everybody that needs to know on how these things are happening. And maybe we will go into something that we have been successful at UNESCO, which is to develop soft law, global standards, because we have everybody. We're very pleased that the US has put their decision to come back to UNESCO, but we have all the countries around the table. I can tell you, having 193 countries signing to a global standard on the ethics of artificial intelligence shows that this can be done. And we are hoping that we will do something similar with issues that are so of high concern, like these ones that we are discussing now. And happy, of course, to contribute to this debate, happy to bring forward our knowledge and our contributions to this very important debate.
Thank you very much, Gabriela. And it's really helpful how your entire presentation underscored that governance is something much broader, much more societal than simply governments taking action. They need to take action, but there's lots of other things that different stakeholders in society have to do. One quick follow-up question, and again, if you can try to be quick, but I mean, it's very interesting, the work that you're describing, and I very much encourage everybody here and myself, when the report is available, to read it. But is there any thinking coming out of that work of how to make happen the kind of broad societal conversations that are needed? It's not just societal within a country, but societal globally. And it's very challenging. It's easy to say it, but it's much more difficult to make it happen. So is there thinking coming out of that work in that regard?
Well, actually, I want to share with you, Janos, and we will be so happy to join forces with all of you. But I can only remit to the previous example that I have since I arrived at UNESCO 2 years ago, when the elaboration of the recommendation on the ethics of artificial intelligence. Mm-hmm. We spent 6 months going around the world, with our 54 offices all around the world, in Africa, Latin America, the North, the South, everybody were engaged, the private sector, the public sector. At the end, Janos, we had the draft recommendation, and then I have 55,000 comments to integrate.
Sounds like the IPCC.
I needed to use artificial intelligence ethically to integrate it in the recommendation. What happened afterwards, and this is what is happening now, that I have so many countries, but not only the countries, the governments, with, of course, for us, the governments are the ones that have duty of care, so they are the ones that need to take the action and translate it into institutions and legal norms. But at the end, is this a participatory process involving the global north, the global south, but the different stakeholders that gets the ownership, and we need ownership in any governance process. Within ownership, people need to feel that they contributed and that their views were taken into account. And this is the only way where a solid framework to discuss these issues can happen. Because if not, what happened is that some part will disengage, another part will not feel they were considered thoroughly. And therefore, it's really important that we go into this. But we have some frameworks that we have used in the past that we're happy to share with all of you in terms of provoking this global debate and ensuring that at least we try to capture all the views, and we try to capture all those that really have something to say. And actually it's everybody, because this concerns everybody.
Thank you very much. Okay, let's go on. There's a lot more to discuss there as well, but let's turn ourselves to Fiji. Amina, are you still with us? Yes, you are. Perfect. Well, are you? Yes. Okay. So what I'd like to do is now just to focus a little bit on how do you see the responsibility of the Global South in this area, if any? And how will such activities impact the Global South, especially the small island developing states? And from your perspective, what actions are needed in the governance area that you could share with us? Just a few thoughts, please. Over to you.
Thank you, Janos. Let me acknowledge the previous speakers, Joe and Gabriela. Thank you so much for the insights and also the scene setting. From the small island developing states perspective, I like a point that that Gabriela mentioned, that are we all in the same page here? For us, we feel that we are a bit lagging behind in these discussions, even though the airplane has already been built. This is an indictment, as Joe puts it, an indictment of the positive efforts, in terms of putting together, the negotiating the convention, as well as the Paris Agreement, that we believe it still remains the cornerstone for our future sustainable development of small island developing states. We are net, we emit very little, as you all know. I don't need to stress that. But the point is very, very clear. The role of the Global South in the discussions, as sorry, Gabriela and Joe, I will make a reference to you because I fully agree with all the issues that you raised. It has to be multidisciplinary, multi-stakeholders, multi-communities, and because people who are affected by climate change are not only those living in the cities. These are women and girls that are in rural communities that are very, very remote. And when we say that we are not able to achieve our agreed global temperature goal of 1.5 degrees, this is a tremendous issue of concern for us. You might recall that our leaders in COP21, there was a slogan that they developed, which says that 1.5 to stay alive. This, rings very, very true to this day. Without 1.5, being achieved, it's an existential threat that we will all face. One of our Pacific leaders mentioned once that we don't fear guns and tanks because we only fear climate change, because that will completely eradicate our communities. So the role of the Global South in terms of that, I think the partnerships amongst the South-South cooperation, as our colleagues from the Indian government mentioned, this needs to be really, really strengthened. so that this transfer of technology, this community of networkings where communities and peoples, those who are vulnerable, are able to network and strengthen their respective responses, towards climate change. So from the seeds perspective, we really believe that the governance issues are important for us. But the question for us, which one is more transparent, is more inclusive in terms of decision making, that will enable to hear our voices. If the Paris Agreement cannot be able to deliver for us, then we don't know what else can deliver for us. Because the process, as we all know, has to be multi-stakeholder. All parties has to be involved in the discussions. We have to play our roles equally, and at the same time, our contributions are heard. The other aspect is in terms of technology transfers. We're talking about, SRM and in here, but how do we stand to gain from this whole process? These are important issues, questions that I will need, to raise with our colleagues in the small and developing states grouping in this discussion. So there is tremendous work that needs to be done in order for us to participate in this discussion. Otherwise, we will always be in the group that always lag behind. So let me just end by saying that the ethical approaches that Gabriela mentioned, I think this is very, very relevant for smaller and developing states and the global south. It becomes a moral value for us. As we say, if we cannot achieve the 1.5 through the cornerstone of our climate agreement, which is the Paris, then we will really have to search for responses or for answers that can be able to sustain us for the long term, let alone achieving the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. Thank you, Janos.
Thank you very much, Amina. And maybe if I could just follow up with a question that is partly to see whether you agree with me, but I think you said, like others, how important it is for the global south to be represented at the kind of conversations that may be taking place. Now, if we agree with that statement, which I certainly would agree with also, then of course the next question that arises is how to build the capacity of those people from the global south who would be participating in those discussions. And maybe from your experience in the climate discussions and elsewhere, if you have any thoughts on how might that happen? Is this about capacity building for science? It's about capacity building for diplomacy. How do you see this strengthening the people from the global south to participate in these discussions?
Thank you, Janos. As you know, from our perspective, an important challenge that we do face is capacity constraints. Our ability to better respond to new solutions or that will enable us to achieve some of our climate solutions. Climate, I mean, talking about capacity building. For us, it's really, really critical that we do participate in available capacity building initiatives that are allowed for under the Paris Agreement or the convention itself, and some other global initiatives that are available for us. It is important to emphasize that without capacity building and without capabilities advancements, like for the science, it is very, very difficult for us to participate fully in this endeavor. This is something that we believe it needs to be undertaken, and in whatever institutional setup or governance structure that we may be relevant with. Perhaps I can mention that in 2024 there will be a 10-year review of the Samoa pathway. Because this is for the sustainable development of small island developing states. This is an area that we can start off with, apart from other initiatives that has been agreed to through our global process. once again, it is important for us to participate in that process, but in a very, very inclusive and transparent manner, so that we are all in the boat, in the words of some of our leaders in the Pacific, that we need to be on the same boat, to travel together. We cannot be in different boats or different canoes. Thank you, Janos.
Thank you very much. And now the last panelist, who's of course co-host and co-organizer of this event, Manish, if you could share with us a few thoughts from your perspective. Also very much looking at this question of what is the responsibility of the Global South, if any, and what governance challenges does it pose? Obviously, India is very different from Fiji, certainly in size, but maybe you have some thoughts on that to share with us.
Thank you, Janos. A lot has already been said. But for me, the entry point for this debate is the question about the learning curve around the technological evolution. Now, I imagine that the learning curve about implementation and impact of these technologies would really look something like an chair-shaped curve. So you have on x-axis the learnings and on y-axis time. So in the early period where you are conceiving it or maybe experimenting at a very small scale within lab or even in real locations, you learn a lot. But then for a long period of time, there is no new learning that comes in your way, and unless and until you deploy these technologies at a larger scale, and then your learnings shoot up. Now, the other examples of this kind of experience that the world has is, I would say, the nuclear bomb, right? So in the early period, the laboratory results and theory told that these are the options, that's how the energy would get released, but we did not really know the horrors till it was Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now, so the governance challenge that I see is along that horizontal line of the chair-shaped curve. That's a huge uncertainty. So the question is, how do we think of governance under uncertainty? I think the best example that we have before us is again the UNFCC. Because when we started negotiations under the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee, the uncertainty was a major question. The first 3 assessment reports of the IPCC had to really deal with that question of uncertainty, to what extent climate change is because of anthropogenic reasons and what its impact would be. So I think the answer for me lies, if not the end, but the beginning of an answer would lie in the principles of the UNFCCC, particularly 3.2, which is precautionary principle, and 3.4 and 3.5, which talks about how do we deal with the negative impacts of climate response measures. So I think this is not so much of a mitigation question. The governance of these technologies is not a mitigation question, it's a question of adaptation governance. So if I can say that, okay, SRM or climate altering technologies are supplementary in the sense that, okay, they are mitigation plus technologies, the governance approach has to be adaptation plus approach. So I would put these technologies to adaptation plus test of governance, and that for me is the loss and damage test. We have progressed, not much, but to some extent on the loss and damage front. So let's put these questions, the deployment of these technologies, in the context of the mechanism on loss and damage, including finance, including the questions of liabilities and who's responsible, who's going to contribute. Of course, the other questions of capacity building and so on would come in. And there, second question from the governance point of view would be that who is going to deploy these technologies and what is going to be the liabilities. And there I would want to make an important distinction that whether the technology is applied or deployed by private players or government players, or private and government players both. Because in these three different settings, the questions of liabilities and responsibilities would be different. We have a similar case in the context of the entry of private players in the outer space. We have a potential threat of debris in the outer space, but international environmental law there is a vacuum on how are we going to deal with the issue of the potential damages that it may cause. What is going to be the liability of private players, or if the liability of private players is there, then what is going to be the extended liability of the states wherein those private players are situated. So I think these are some of the entry points. So in brief, my proposition is to think about governance and responsibility related to geoengineering technologies is to put them under the broad umbrella of loss and damage framework and governance. Now, one brief point on the uncertainty part. When we are on the horizontal curve of learning curve, I think some of the examples of deployment, for example, brightening of clouds in case of Australia, where the great coral reef was bleaching was an issue. If one can think of these technologies as localized adaptation solutions, there is a scope to learn. Of course, one will have to go with extreme precaution, but these are perhaps the positive entry points to thinking about these questions. The reluctance from developing world side, I think Mr. Sood and Ambassador already placed out. So I thought I'd close with some possible acceptable entry points.
Thank you very much. And maybe if I could just ask you one follow-up question. While I do that, please think of your questions, audience, but I'll come to that in a moment. But just a quick follow-up question. So maybe if you could just say a few more words, not too long, but a few more words about how do you envisage the consideration of the governance issues related, let's say, to solar radiation modification in a loss and damage context? Because you mentioned that a couple of times, but how might that look like?
So I'm thinking that if you, let's say, deploy aerosols at a much larger scale, then it's going to have transboundary implications that may affect your precipitation patterns in some regions. So obviously the question is, and that may not be welcome in the areas where that happens. So the question is how you prove that there is a causal relationship, but then who initiated that experiment, who gave the green signal to go ahead with the large-scale deployment of aerosols in the upper atmosphere, and then who is getting affected, and how the compensation should be. Or in a different way, if we know that there is a possibility of this kind, and there is an uncertainty of how those possibilities would be distributed across multiple jurisdictions, what are the preventive adaptive measures that could be simultaneously taken, and who should be responsible to pay for that?
Okay, thank you very much. Look, I know that Gabriella Ramos has to leave because she has another meeting, but we still have three of our panelists with us. So Gabriella, thank you very much. The floor is open now for questions. So please raise your hand and just introduce who you are. And if you have a question directed to any one of the participants, please do. If not, then to the whole panel, and then we'll pick up maybe a couple of questions and we'll see how it goes. So go ahead, let's start. The gentleman here in front.
Yeah, thanks a lot. My name is Harinder. I'm from Delhi only. And I am into the business of battery refurbishment. I'm giving second life to the batteries, old batteries. And now the question related to because today's topic is very likely with my pet subject, the science and governance of the climate altering techniques. Now the climate altering techniques, I'm only focusing on the one subject on the climate, is that on refrigeration as an example for this technique. Now in the last 30 years, if you see, the whole world is being run by the different kind of laws and roadmaps from the US and from the European countries towards the Asian countries. Now, for example, earlier the gases were R22, and that was being used for last almost 40, 50 years. And later on, suddenly the ozone depletion, it came into picture. And everyone has been focusing on that one. It is threat to the humankind for the skin cancer and all those things. But later on, it has been introduced with the target with the R410 and R134A gases. This is a very one small example, and which reflect on the other techniques also for the other examples. And I'm coming to that one only, that what is my concern on that one is that now after R22, the next gas came. Now finally 410 is come into the picture. Now with that one on the other side, if I ask my question is not to you, it is overall to the world leaders, basically with respect to the techniques being implicated on the world, that how much now if we see that ozone depletion is there 20 years back, 10 years back, and now what was the effect on that one before and after of that implication of the techniques? Number one. Number two, that now these gases which has been introduced, then why it is being suddenly changes every 5 years now, where the R22 gas, if I am example as that one, is that it is the only mixture of the single gas. Now the later on the gases has been introduced as a multiple gases. So with that one, if something is get leaked, the whole system has to be replaced with that gases rather than topping up that small gas on that one. So, thank you.
We'll keep that in mind. Any other question? I think there was a gentleman with a red thing. Yes, there with the red band, black shirt. And then the next one will be over here. Yes, and then over here. We'll take those four, and then we'll have one round of responses.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much for such an informative session. My name is Mohammed Sultan, and I work for a donor collaborative that's looking at climate mitigation. I've got 2 questions. We'll try to keep them super short. Someone in the panel mentioned previously the dangers of the concentration of the technology in the hands of a very few as part of the governance. Do you have a sense of how many dollars, how many resources, how much money is being invested currently into research and development of these technologies? And where are these companies, or where are these governments from?
Okay,
that's one. The second part is, I know there's been, I think the gentleman mentioned the sort of the parallel track of looking at loss and damage and geoengineering in general. I wonder to what extent, and this is for all of you, how present is the conversation on consent of the deployment of this potential deployment of these technologies in the overall governance discourse, and are multilateral institutions even equipped to be able to have this conversation currently? Thank you.
Very interesting questions. Thank you. The lady here, and then the gentleman up front here, and then we'll have a first round of responses.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, sir, for recognizing me. I am Dimple Adlakha from Lady Owen College, Delhi University. So we have been talking a lot about climate change and the sustainable development. So my question is, don't you think that the policies we have made on national and global level are too idealistic to achieve? But if we promote more of behavior change and participatory approach of development in, on the global level, like Gabriela ma'am and Fiji sir has also mentioned that we should focus more on multi-stakeholder approach and that capacity building thing. So that's what's my question.
Very interesting. And then the gentleman up front here.
So, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rajiv Ranjan. I'm a researcher from IIT Guwahati. And my question is with, especially with the team of OECD. See, everyone is talking about only the carbon dioxide removal. But we know that methane is one of the biggest culprit also in, in global temperature rising. Especially like, the agricultural sector, which is the second largest emitter in terms of methane. So I know as per the Paris Agreement, everyone is focusing only about the carbon mitigations and measures and all that. Why we are leaving the methane? So my question is with OECD team, if any research which is related done in terms of methane capturing and methane mitigations, it will be, if you can highlight on that point, and any future prospects or possibilities if we can explore in Indian market, especially in the Indian agricultural sectors, considering the methane.
Thank you. So I would now like to ask our panelists, you don't have to answer all 4 questions, the ones you are able to. Let's start with Joe, since the last question was also specifically to the OECD, and you may want to address that one, but let's go around. Thank you.
Thanks, Janos, and I'm sorry and apologies in advance. I'm already a little bit late for my next meeting, so I'll just answer quickly. Now, I'm not going to answer all the questions. I wanted to make a couple of comments. I will pick up on the last one, though. Yes, of course, there is work being done beyond carbon dioxide, but all greenhouse gases that are covered by the Paris Agreement, for example. There are a number of initiatives focusing on methane, both from industrial processes, the kind of flaring and so on, but also from agriculture. We know, of course, that agricultural production is one of those very hard to abate sectors. Now, not from an OECD perspective, but from a New Zealand one, which is an agricultural producing nation, there's an enormous amount of research investment that has been put into place to look at viable and commercializable, if I can use that word, techniques to reduce methane emission, particularly from livestock production. So 2 things to bear in mind. One is a global research alliance on agricultural greenhouse gas emissions, which is looking including not only livestock, but also croplands and paddy rice. So that collaborative has been going for well over a decade now. There's also a global methane hub, which is looking very closely at reductions in how to achieve reductions in methane in both industrial and agricultural settings. So it's not been forgotten. It's a hugely important part. The 2 comments I wanted to very quickly make. First of all, this is basically in response to Amina, and I want to really acknowledge the huge importance of the work that SIDS did in the context of COP21 in arguing so cogently for 1.5. Because the tipping points report I referred to earlier makes it quite clear that even with a pathway of 1.5 degrees being achieved, the chances of crossing tipping points are exceedingly high. So kudos to the SIDS for pushing really hard for 1.5. And the second point is in response to the argument that this should be somehow rolled in, governance should be rolled into loss and damage. I'm not sure that it is a super helpful approach to start thinking about, attributing blame and talking about liability and compensation as a response to dealing with climate altering techniques, the geoengineering and so on. I really think that's probably not conducive to finding a good global response that meets the criteria we've all laid out. And equally, as I talked earlier, it's really important to avoid path dependency. And if you put it in the adaptation basket or the loss and damage basket, I think you risk taking the eye off the mitigation ball. And we've got to keep 1.5 alive. I do subscribe to that. Thanks, Janos.
Thank you, Joe. And technically, we've been talking about overshoot. We have overshot the time allocated to us as well. But I'm sure we will not be kicked out of this room if we complete responses to a couple of questions. But if you do have to leave, Joe, we understand. But we like to continue with responses. Amina, do you have any reflections on the questions asked?
Thank you, Janos, for those useful questions from our audience. I would like to thank the lady for questions in relation to why policies are too idealistic. I guess, the best response is that these are outcomes of negotiations. And I entirely agree with her that before negotiations, consultations with all our communities, all those who are affected should be undertaken, whether it's a new technology rollout or even who owns the technology, as was raised. The consultation has to be there, and we firmly believe it has to be a bottom-up, not an approach, where the community can be engaged. In regards to the question on the mitigation aspect, I entirely agree with Joe that for us, SIDS, we look at the best form of adaptation is mitigation. That's something that we cannot rule out. And whatever forms, and if there are additional techniques that has been developed, like it needs to be equally apportioned and roll out, to those who cannot afford it. And the question that we always have in mind as small and developing states, and the question in regards to the concentration, by the gentleman that asked that question, the danger of concentration of technology. This is where the role of global South is really important. We need to deploy resources and assist smaller countries in the global South, like India, Fiji, China, Fiji. I mean, not only Fiji, but smaller Maldives, Mauritius, and our Caribbean colleagues that really demands this kind of technology to be rolled out. So the question of IPR, who owns, the rights and all those things is something that also needs to be involved in this kind of discussions. It has to be multi-stakeholder. We really need, a very broad-based discussions in order to take these issues forward. Thank you, Janos.
Thank you very much. Manish, would you like to respond briefly to a few?
Well, just two quick clarifications. One is on refrigerant technologies. Those are not climate altering technologies. Those are typical mitigation technologies, and the policies being idealistic. Policies are pragmatic. Behavioral change is actually idealistic.
That's a good one. Okay, well, look, thank you very much. I think we do need to close, but if there are still other questions, maybe we can, once the cameras stop, we're happy to engage bilaterally, but I think we do need to bring this to a conclusion in a formal sense. In the meantime, I got a message from Mr. Desai. He is not able to make it, so he cannot do the closing remarks either. But and I'm not going to make a long speech, especially after such a fascinating discussion. Thank you very much for the participants, for the speakers, for TERI. But I think for me, 2 important issues out of this discussion. One is that These are complex issues. There's no simple silver bullet, yes or no answer, or this is the way, or that is the way. It's complicated. And the second is that there has to be really serious engagement of the key stakeholders. And the key stakeholders, I think we need to say that very clearly, that the people that are most likely to be impacted by climate change and by the use or not of these new techniques are in the global south. And therefore, and to use Gabriela Ramos's point, has to be people-centered. It has to be centered in people in the global south, these discussions. And right now we have the opposite. So there is a lot of work to do. And I hope that this discussion was one step in that direction, and I hope there will be more. So with that, thank you very much. And maybe my colleague from TERI can bring us to a formal conclusion.
Thank you, sir. On behalf of TERI and WSDS Secretariat, we thank all the distinguished speakers for an insightful and thought-provoking deliberations. For our online participants, stay tuned, and we request all the delegates to remain seated for the next session. The next session will be starting shortly. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you, Janusz, for curating this event. It was really wonderful. Thank you.